It is no secret to all Iraqis the dangerous goals behind the call for the formation of a national salvation government. It is simply an attempt by those who rebel against the constitution to end the young democratic process and confiscate the opinions of the voters and circumvent of the constitutional merits. The call for the formation of a national salvation government is a coup against the constitution and the political process.
The support will be intense, sustained, and if Iraq's leaders take the necessary steps to bring the country together, it will be effective. It will allow Iraqi security forces to confront ISIL more effectively and in a way that respects Iraq's sovereignty while also respecting America's and the region's vital interests.
American authorities are trying to portray this as a sectarian war, but what is happening in Iraq is not a war between Shia and Sunnis. It is indeed the same old hegemonic order, using leftovers of the Saddam Hussein regime as its key pieces, and the Takfiri dogmatic elements as foot soldiers. The US is seeking an Iraq under its hegemony and ruled by its stooges.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Between the Lines, where we're continuing our coverage of the ongoing crisis in Iraq. Whereas the battle for Iraq continues, government troops are making steady advances in the north of the country as militants belonging to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant seize more territory further west. Meanwhile, Tehran is blaming the U.S. for the escalating crisis, while Washington appears to be pushing for a change in Iraq's leadership. To discuss this further, let's bring in our guests for this evening. In the studio, I'm joined by a Mideast expert, Dr. Kamel Wazni. Also in the studio with me, we have a Beirut-based journalist, Mr. Ross Fitzgerald. And last but by no means least, from London, we are joined by Mr. Ahmed Rahman Jamal. He is a political analyst. A warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Dr. Wazni, if I can begin with you here. Is this a coup against Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's government?
Well, this is actually a terrorist invasion conducted by these terrorist entities supported by Persian Gulf countries. The whole aim of this operation to topple the regime and take back Iraq to chaos, and there's help from this ISIS group. And in addition to
so you do agree with Prime Minister Maliki when he said that this is a coup against the country's constitution?
Obviously, this is, if he put it that way, it is the way I see it. This is an extension of the war that is taking place by these terrorist organizations. They're spreading this war into Iraq, and the whole purpose is destroying the country and take it back to the old days when the old regime was in control, because the fact now we have these entities, a terrorist organization, with the old Ba'athist fighting together against the Iraqi people.
Okay, we're going to talk about who exactly is fighting the government in Baghdad a little bit later on. But Mr. Abdulrahman, if I can bring you into the discussion here, there's a lot of people who are saying that it's actually Maliki who is to blame for the deteriorating situation in Iraq. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the Iraqi situation at the moment is very serious, and I think we cannot just leave ourselves to recrimination between the different political parties, whether internal, whether regional or international. I think the situation needs immediate action, and that immediate action doesn't necessarily mean like military action or the use of force. I'm against the use of force, but I think any political situation which the United States and some other parties involved in the conflict, maybe they try to push forward to a settlement, a peaceful settlement. But I think that peaceful settlement also needs some kind of consideration. Okay, the government, the Iraqi government will say,
Mr. Abdulrahman, if I can just jump in there for a moment. My question to you was, do you think that Prime Minister Maliki is to blame for the current situation that Iraq finds itself in?
This is what I'm trying to say. You see, it's not al-Maliki himself. It's not al-Maliki. It's not his party. It's not the coalition. I think it's a number of factors that created that situation, that awkward situation. I think, in my opinion, you see, the interference in the affairs of Iraq has been taking place a long time ago, whether internal, I mean, this bickering among the political parties, political blocs. And you see, Nouri al-Maliki tried to bring maybe these pieces together, but I think, in my opinion, he failed. Why he failed? Because maybe he was not, in a way, maybe he was not trying to give in sometimes in order to win something else. You know, because this is diplomacy, and in diplomacy, in politics, you know, you need sometimes to give in, sometimes you need to grab or to take some benefits. So this is what we expect from him. But I think he was rigid, very rigid. This is my point. You know, he didn't listen to the voices that sometimes coming from people who support him in a way, and maybe they want him good. But anyway,
okay,
he's not
at the moment, there are a lot of voices.
Iraq. It's not Maliki.
Right, there are a lot of voices at the moment, Ross,
which are the Kurds, but it's a combination of all these. They were in power and they were responsible for all the decisions he had taken. So it's not him. No, not only him.
Okay, well, speaking there of all the different factors that have influenced this crisis, let's talk about the visit by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to Iraq this week. There's a lot of people who are suggesting that Kerry was there to tell Maliki that he has to go.
Well, I think one of the things that I've been hearing is that Kerry was there telling Maliki that he has to open up the possibility of a unity government and bringing in these other sides into
which Maliki today said he will not do.
Well, that's what I mean. That was my understanding of his statement about counter-constitutional or coup or whatever term it was translated as. But his point was to enforce on him a unity government would constitute.
Why is the U.S. talking about a unity government when Iraq held legislative elections in April, where Maliki and his ruling state of law coalition emerged as the clear winner?
Well,
I mean, it doesn't get more inclusive than that, does it?
Presumably that's a rhetorical question, because the outcome of those elections has been a government which has alienated the Sunni population to an extent that we've got a large swathes of the north of Iraq who are accepting of ISIS coming into the country, ISIS who are not in their ideology representative of the vast majority of Sunnis in Iraq at all, and yet they are seen by so many of the public there as being the only true and faithful representatives of Sunni interests, because specifically Maliki has failed to stick with the line which he had earlier, it should be remembered, in his premiership. He has not always been someone who was the hammer of the Sunnis, but not by any stretch. Early on, when he was first in government, he was someone who was seen as a much more inclusive figure, and it's only been a gradual turning away from the Sunni and to an extent the Kurdish parts of the country and representatives that we've seen over recent years. He has only recently started to alienate them over the past few years.
Dr. Wasni, there's been a lot of talk about that, right? This is Maliki alienating the Sunni population, and that is why we've seen this advance across Iraq by the ISIL. What's your response to that?
I don't think he is alienating the Sunnah. I think the Sunnah for a very long time been in control of Iraq. And even they are the minority and they represent maybe 20%, 25% of the population. They've been in control throughout history. And the fact now we have an election and different kind of government, and now they have the representation they deserve in the government. They're not accepting the status quo.
But this is something that doesn't get said enough. They are all in the government. All these different groups are in the government.
We have an election in Iraq. Everybody actually congratulate Maliki for having a fair election, and there is a fair representation throughout Iraq. And they gave more vote and more representation to the Sunnah, especially in this area in the north. But the fact they're not accepting this democratic process, it's not them. It's not the Sunnah inside Iraq. It's the Arab country who refused to deal with the Maliki. That's why Saudi Arabia refused to send an ambassador. That's what Qatar and Kuwait and every Arab country refused to wipe out the debt. back in 2003 when they met in Paris and decided to forgive Iraq, that the Arab country, they said we have to see who's going to be in charge, and they didn't like that the government is going to go for somebody else. Now it's a conspiracy that is actually constructed by these countries, even the American actually talking about this. When you have a country like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, actually they're not happy to have Iraq strong, independent, economically well off. They engineer this attack against Iraq.
Okay, Ross,
we have to
if I can just
remember.
stop you right there, Doctor, because I want to get your response to some of that there, Ross.
I mean, I think we can overplay that. And I do think that we need to be very careful about keeping distinct the Sunni population of Iraq, the Sunni people who are living there and have lived there for a long time, and their attitudes to Baghdad, and the advance of ISIS effectively from Syria through the north of the country. It's very important that we don't start talking about the alienation of the Sunni and the attitude of Maliki and his government towards the people of Iraq as being the factor which brought this about in any great sense. It's more that by alienating or by in their eyes failing to represent the interests of the Sunni members of the country, he's simply made it easy ground for ISIS to sort of spread through down towards Baghdad.
I think the more important point that Dr. Wasni is making here is that it is a regional, perhaps a global conspiracy.
Here I'll have to mention, this is Senator Randy Paul. He's from Canada. He said Sunnah extremists backed by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Qatar has filled the vacuum. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS have taken the city of Mosul, Tikrit on the march to Baghdad. Even the United States admit that indirectly helped these terrorist organizations, and he said it very clearly. He said the administration, through bad decision making that I specifically warn against, has already indirectly added Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, the very group some now propose to counter with US troops. They actually acknowledge the misguided policy of the United States with these Arab countries. There are the reason behind of all the mess that is taking place, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, and in other part in Lebanon, with the explosion that's taking place right now.
You
the
need
guy
to be
who
careful
exploded himself today is a Saudi nationalist.
Okay, let me stop you right there. I don't want to go into Lebanon.
You need to be careful
but this is
about
the whole thing is connected.
It's not necessarily that what you're saying is incorrect, some of what you're saying, but you do need to be careful. If you want to make your point kind of convincingly, you need to be careful about the straw men that you're putting up. Rand Paul does not speak on behalf of the US. He is an American man, and he is very much not representative.
So
that is an important point.
The Congress, he's in the Intelligence Committee.
He is not a
he has
representative
ample
of the
information about what's taking place, and he represents.
I'm just telling you, I'm not even disagreeing with what you're saying as your conclusions.
Who conducted the war against Iraq, he has the same sentiment in editorial in the Wall Street Journal. So it's not one senator. It's a sentiment going in the United States that the Obama administration misguided, run this mess in the Middle East. That's what the recent polling in the United States just 2 days ago blamed the President of the United States for failing to conduct a fair policy, and he actually helped all these terrorist organizations, and he brought a state of terrorism to the region. America, Obama brought a state of terrorism to the region. He should be actually held in contempt, and the Congress should impeach him, because helping terrorists is not what America is all about.
Okay,
you're going off on a sort of a slightly bizarre tangent. All I'm telling you is that
this is the sentiment that is speaking.
All I'm telling you is that.
Okay, Dr. Wasni, let's.
All I'm saying is that if you're trying to make this point, the convincing way of making the point, and the way to bring other people around to your point of view, is not to point to the likes of Rand Paul and say, therefore the Americans have admitted it, and therefore it's true.
Not elected by the American people.
Doesn't
he's not
matter.
Senator in the United States Congress.
It doesn't matter whether this guy
Does it matter?
It doesn't matter whether this guy shares your opinion or not. The facts on the ground are what we need to be looking at.
Well, let's look at the facts on the ground, Ross. If just there's been a lot of talk about the American military training ISIL fighters just across the border in Jordan, then sending them over into Syria, and then shipping them over into Iraq.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk about everything, and as we've talked about before, conspiracy theories will always rise up. I'm not saying that the US doesn't have an interest here. They absolutely do. What I'm saying is, if you're going to criticize convincingly and legitimately US policy or the policy of other Gulf states, or the policy of Iran, or the policy of Baghdad, or the policy of ISIS or of Damascus, you have to do it in sober terms, I'm afraid, and you also have to do it without kind of getting hysterical about sort of outlying opinions which are not representative of these states.
The United States supply arms to these terrorist organizations in Syria. Even Mr. Crocker, actually the ex-ambassador to Iraq, he wrote another editorial. He blamed the American administration for failing and helping these terrorist organizations in Syria. And those who fought in Iraq came from Syria.
Okay, I mean, I'm genuinely a bit confused. So I'm going to ask you to clarify what
you're not accepting member of the U.S. Congress. You're not accepting a senator. Who you want to accept?
I'm just genuinely going to ask you, are you saying that, so I understand what your position is, are you saying that you think the US wants ISIS to take Baghdad? Just clarify for me.
No, the US indirectly, that's what he said, help these terrorist organizations, allow these terrorist organizations, allow the Arab country, even Mr. Kerry, when he went to the region and he was in Egypt, some official from his group, he said, we cannot talk to the Arab country to dry up the money that is coming from these Persian Gulf country. He know exactly that money is coming. Did we see an American administration taking a sanction against one bank, taking any position against any of these countries? He's talking to them.
Okay, Dr. Wazni, I do have to stop you gentlemen right there because I do want to give some airtime to our guest in London, Mr. Abdul Rahman. Just what are your thoughts on some of that there? Is Washington using this opportunity, or is it fueling this militancy in order to get rid of Maliki's government?
You see, I mean, there was a lot of talking during your discussion with your guests in the studio, and I think you see I'll come back to Washington, but I think the main issue now in Iraq is not Shia and Sunni as people may imagine sometimes. Sometimes they augment the whole situation, saying that the Sunnis were alienated, the Shias were the upper hand, they had everything, they had the money, they had the power. While if you look back, you can see that the whole tension started immediately after 2003, when Saddam was ousted. Immediately it started, but it started gradually. And the government did not deal with that one. That's the problem, you see. The new government, it was not al-Maliki, it was Alawi, and then it was Jafari, and then Maliki. They tried to deal with it, but very shyly. And they were not able to do that because they put their agenda first. And what was that agenda? Is just to build the country in a way that would, maybe they wanted to do something, but sluggishly. It's because they were combination of enemies. I would say enemies. Yes, you see the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurds inside the government. They were not in agreement at all. There is always a bone of contention, and they hate each other. They talk about they even drive a dagger in the backs of others. But I think, you see, Washington is trying to look at, I mean, when Washington was forced to leave Iraq, and I think the last soldier left Iraq in 2011, I think what happened is that the Iraqis were very happy because the Americans left, because they think that, and then the slogan that everybody shouting is no to America, as if America was the enemy. While in fact, I don't know how they look at it, but in my opinion, I think America came to help Iraq, to give them the opportunity to rule themselves by themselves in a democratic way.
Well, there's certainly, Mr. Abdul Rahman, if I could just stop you right there,
they didn't like it.
Because on that particular point, there's certainly quite a few people that would disagree with you there. Ross, if I could just come to you here. I mean, we're talking about our discussion about U.S. lawmakers and U.S. policy in Iraq. Now, some U.S. lawmakers, specifically the more neocon far-right Republican members, have called for airstrikes against these ISIL militants in Iraq. Shouldn't that logically extend to Syria then as well?
Do you mean extend to Syria conducting airstrikes in Iraq? Because that happened this week.
Extend U.S. If the U.S. is going to talk about hitting ISIL militants in Iraq, then technically that should entail hitting ISIL militants in Syria who are fighting the government in Damascus.
Yeah, I mean certainly there's a question of a thin end of the wedge with so many of these matters that relate to the U.S. policy, certainly because there's been such a kind of a deliberate stepping out and disengagement. They were so pleased to get out and get away and think this is not our trouble anymore. So any further involvement at all in the region is seen as seen as a crossing of the Rubicon. Just to get boots on the ground is a major deal, because the worry is this the beginning of a new major deployment? These 300 special forces troops who are going into Iraq, is that the beginning of a major deployment? And
what do you think? Is it?
I think not, because I think that politically it's just unfeasible. I think the only reason that 300 troops have gone in from the US so far, and obviously there's 35 drone flights a day. There's a lot of surveillance work that the US is still doing to support the Baghdad government. The only reason there's any involvement...
Well, there's no evidence that those drone flights, I think the number you're talking about is 30 drone flights daily over Iraq. The Pentagon released those numbers yesterday, but there's no evidence to suggest that they are supporting the government in Baghdad with that information.
Well, I mean, that's a fair point. I suppose it's supporting the US agenda, which we understand at the moment to be supporting the Baghdad government. They're certainly not overtly supporting ISIS, and there's no suggestion that they want to see ISIS grow in strength because of it's self-evident that the democratic government, Shia-led and stable in Baghdad, would be much preferable with sovereignty over the whole of Iraq and potentially excluding the Kurdish areas compared to an ISIS statelet in the north of Iraq, or spreading into Syria, or spreading around and solidifying itself as a statelet. So there's no question that American interests, even if you're saying that US policy in the Middle East is entirely driven by US interests, it still carries through that opposing ISIS is absolutely the best policy, the policy that the US wants to see borne out.
Okay, well let's talk about. Go ahead.
The fact you're opposing and not doing anything, that's a major. It's being and actually
well,
being
that's
a partner.
That's what I want to ask you. That's what I want to ask you, Doctor. I want to ask you about that, because we're talking about what the Americans are saying, what the Americans are doing, but what do the Americans want? Are they looking to put boots back on the ground in Iraq? Are they looking to dismember the government? What exactly are the Americans looking to do here?
The United States withdrawn from Iraq. They're not coming back to Iraq, but they like to see their interest in Iraq being protected.
What is that interest?
Their interest, the flow of oil, to have a friendly government other than the Maliki government. They, I don't think they have a very much like for the Maliki. They refuse to support him. Even the weapon that he bought from Washington, they never been delivered. He bought helicopters, he bought Apache, he bought F-16 ammunition. Even the ammunition for Hellfires that he bought 500 missile, they didn't deliver to him. So actually he put the money up, but the support did not come. I think there's a lot of people in the United States do not approve of the Maliki. They probably did not get the deal that they wanted him to give them when they withdrew from Iraq, and I think Maliki is paying for it today, because
why is that? Why are the Americans dragging their feet? I mean, essentially they did promise to support this government against terrorists.
Yeah, and I think what they were the people that they were seeking to arm, or the group they were seeking to arm when they were agreed to these weapons sales, was the Iraqi army, the National Army, which has obviously sort of disintegrated and has been shown to be a bit of a scarecrow more than anything else. Now, it's clearly worrying for the US, as for anyone who's watching this, that the state of Iraq has an armed forces which have disintegrated, and now the leader of the country has to call on Shia militias as his main opponent to a terrorist insurgency in the north of the country. Everyone, whether you're an Iraqi Shia, whether you're an Iraqi Sunni...
He did not call on the Shia, he called on the Iraqi people. So the Said Sistani, he called on the Iraqi people.
Yeah.
So he did not call on the Shiite, he called for every Iraqi who doesn't want these terrorist organizations to be in existence, to go and fight them.
And my point, of course,
70% of the
just to
country
finish the
are
point,
Shiite, so they happen to volunteer and vote. So it's not really a Shiite against Sunnah. It's Iraqi people who wanted their country back from these terrorist organizations, and the United States failed them.
Which is by the by,
miserably.
that's sort of entirely peripheral to the point I was making. So I mean, what my point is that if you're a foreign
No, but
country,
you
a
said
foreign
the
power,
Shiite,
and
the
you
Shiite,
want
it's called the call for the Iraqi.
they are Shia groups. It
Where
doesn't matter.
Maliki said
it was
the
by the by
Shiite,
with the
he
point
didn't
of
say the
the-
Shiite. Where says Sistani called the Shiite? He called the Iraqi people. So the language doesn't play very much.
Well, if he didn't say Shia, then he can't have meant Shia. I mean, come on, like you have to, let's stop playing games. I mean, obviously,
No, it's not game.
the reality
This
is that
basically
these
we
are
had a lot
Shia
of
groups.
Sunnis
They are Shia
actually
fighting.
calling to arm themselves against these
Absolutely.
extremists.
But ISIS are not
So
saying.
it's
Look,
really
ISIS are not saying it's a Sunni
Sunni-
exclusive. They're saying everybody who agrees with us come in. They've never said the word Sunni. They just say everybody who agrees with us, and it just happens to be the fact
and the
that
Maliki
their-
said we
that their
against
priorities are
these
Sunni
terrorist
priorities.
organization, and we have to find them. Even the United States agree on that. They said, even General Dempsey said ISIS is a dangerous terrorist group. Wherever we find it, we have to fight it and eliminate it. And
Fine,
that's what
I agree.
Maliki said that.
But as in answer to the question that I was asked, which is what I was in the process of answering before you interrupted me to make your point, the reason there has been a problem with these weapon sales is because they were meant for the army. They are not. They would not go to the army. They would disintegrate and go, or they would dissipate and go off into the rest of the
if
country.
they gave him the weapon, ISIS will not be in the country.
Okay, Doctor, I do have to stop you right there, gentlemen, because we do have to go to a very quick break right now. But do stay with us. We'll be right back.
Time. Variable. Events. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The globe on our platform. Evening. Women's rights redefined.
Welcome back. You're watching Between the Lines. Just to remind you, we're talking about that ongoing crisis in Iraq. And before we took a break, we were talking about the American or potential American role in that crisis. If I can go to London to Mr. Abdulrahman here. Mr. Abdulrahman, does Washington have a duty here to interfere and help the Baghdad government, since many people would argue that it was the U.S. invasion of Iraq that instigated a lot of these sectarian divisions?
You see, at this moment, let me say something, please. You see, at this moment, I think Iraq is burning. And what we need is not to try to find out or to single out people or parties or whatever, but I think Iraq is facing a danger. And that danger should be solved. Whether with the help of the United States, with the help of Iran, with the help of Turkey, with the help of God knows who. But I think Iraq should be helped at this moment to get rid of that bloody war, because hundreds of thousands of people die.
Yeah, but Mr. Abdurrahman, in order to do that, isn't it logical, in order to do that, in order to do what you're saying, it's logical to try to identify what the problem is in the first place. I mean, if we're talking about military help from the Americans, shouldn't we at least figure out if the Americans want these militant advances to go ahead in the first place?
I think the American has an obligation, according to the the impact. I mean, the pact of the strategic cooperation between Iraq and the United States. I think they have an obligation, but would they be able to deliver? That's the point. You see, now when the ground starts rumbling, I think the Iraqi government and Nouri al-Maliki himself, asked the United States to come over and provide some help. I think this is the dilemma. Sometimes they were rejected. The Americans were rejected in the past, and now we ask them for. It's a kind of, the Americans, that's why they are reluctant, because they think that the Iraqi people are a little bit of showing some kind of ingratitude, because we helped them, we killed people, our soldiers died, we spent a lot of money to help the Iraqis, and then they say, no, we don't want you Americans, get out, you are our enemies. I think this is a wrong interpretation of the politics, and the diplomacy followed by the Iraqi government. I think the Iraqi government need a clear-cut policy showing that, look, we are friends with the United States. Why are they shy? They should say it. The United States is not going to attack from Iraq another country. No, this is in the agreement. But I think at least to provide some help, some military help for the Iraqis to get rid of Daesh and the Wahhabis, who are just pestering the country. This is the main point, I think, in my opinion. Let's shake hands with the Americans. Let them deal with the Americans. Forget about whoever says, okay, no, don't. You are not patriotic enough. I think patriotism means to defend the country against those people coming from different world, different parts of the world, just to try to wreck the political situation.
Between Iraq and Syria, it's a point we touched on earlier. What is the difference, and why, if the US is so willing to come and intervene for their interests or for the interests of the existing government holding the capital or whatever, why are they willing to intervene in Iraq in such a way that they're not willing to intervene in Syria? And it is this sort of moral obligation, this historic obligation from the intervention which is previous. The American people know that they went in and they shook the magic 8 ball in Iraq in 2003. They changed the situation, and this is what it's come with. So there is an obligation for the US to go in and just make sure that any damage they've caused, it's a Hippocratic element, any damage they've caused, they feel responsible for. And you see it actually even still with post-colonial relationships. In the Central African Republic, at the moment, you see the French are the only non-African country involved, and they're actually the only country involved trying to perform peacekeeping there during a horrific humanitarian incident there. And that's not because there's any particularly strong economic links anymore, in fact, between the Central African Republic and France. It's because France was the colonial power, and there is this moral obligation which still has that weight among the voters in a democracy. The voters in a democracy like France, the US, or any country, they are more willing to accept the expenditure of lives to intervene for humanitarian causes in a former colony or a former sort of theater of chosen war, which is what Iraq was for the US.
Dr. Wazni, you touched on the different elements that are fighting the Baghdad government at the moment. Of course, you said the Baathists. Now they're led by Saddam's former deputy, Izzat al-Duri. Now, while the ISIL wants to create this Islamic emirate, if you will, these guys, the Baathists, they want a state away from Shia rule, which essentially brings into question, is Iraq about to be broken up into 3 different pieces?
Well, there's reality. Actually, the Kurd now, they already decided at any moment they can declare in their state, and they can be independent because they were fighting for Kirkuk, and actually they conspire with
which, by the way, they call their Jerusalem.
Yes, and because it has 26% of the oil reserve of Iraq, and they have a major interest to have it as part of their country. And today, I think the Americans try to persuade the Kurd, as we saw from Mr. Kerry's visit. I don't know what the internal talk were between the American and the Kurd, but they're opportunistic in that sense, and they actually taken the easy way out of this conflict. Actually, probably there's some other people like to see maybe this part that was under control of Daesh to be actually also secede from Iraq. But does this serve the integrity of Iraq? Does this make Iraq more safer? I think economically it would be better for probably for Mr. Maliki and the people in the south to actually separate themselves, because they have all the wealth, because all the oils, despite all the fighting, still flow through.
Well, the Kurds would have enough to sustain their own state,
yes,
that's for sure.
So actually, economically, those people who are fighting and controlling their area, they're going to be the loser of any disintegration of Iraq.
Except for maybe one big other loser, if it went that way. The Sunni areas are the practically unpopulated West, and that reminds me, when you look at it, of somewhere like northern Mali, which 5 years ago no one cared about, and now all of a sudden everybody cares about. Now all of a sudden the US intelligence community is very interested in northern Mali and West Africa, because the whole region throughout the Sahel there, because they understand that this is an area of the world which is very sparsely populated, has very kind of old tribal society networks, and basically is a perfect safe haven for terrorist groups who could be specifically targeting Western.
But you have to remember, the United States know all along these terrorist organization does exist, does prosper in this area. The fact that in 2013, 500 suicide bombing hit Baghdad and Iraq, and 8,000 people were killed, and the United States did not do anything, did not condemn it. They know exactly that where the money is coming. What the United States is doing is arming these Persian Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia by itself bought $60 billion of arms. The United States was very happy to sell these arms to Saudi Arabia and Arab Emirates and Kuwait, and refused to give any ammunition to the government of Iraq. Why is the double standard of the American? Because they don't like Iraq, because they think Iraq is close to Iran. Iraq took this different perspective on Syria. Iraq could fall in the resistant axis. So it's the deliberate act of the United States, put the United States at jeopardy and build these terrorist states. United States actually helped Al-Qaeda in Syria, brought all these terrorists from all over the world, directly or indirectly. Sit quiet about Turkey when they actually interfere and help these terrorist organizations. So the United States, when you talk about the moral obligation, what moral obligation you mentioned here? What moral obligation? Is there a moral obligation from the United States? They killed, how many people they killed in Iraq?
Okay.
How much destruction they did in Iraq?
Going back,
there is no moral obligation.
Your response.
I was so quiet about it.
If I can just stop you right there, Doctor. Let's give Ross
in Iraq from 2003
let's give Ross an opportunity
now
to respond to some of that. Ross, it's a very fair point, though. Going back to something that Dr. Wazni said. I mean, the Saudis are known to be behind these groups. The Saudis are a very close ally of the Americans. Without making these extravagant conspiracy theories, there is a very direct link there, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the question is how much of the funding is coming through channels which these states have control over. Now we know that a great deal of the funding that flows to a large extent through Qatar, kind of unfettered, comes to many of these
Kuwait,
groups.
The American, look at the Washington Institute, look at the Carnegie, they put a lot of document. I asked him the other day, why did you decide to put them now? Those all the news. They said, oh, now there's something that we should put them now. The American knows, the intelligence knows all this money coming. Why we didn't see an action by the Treasury Department of the United States? They know every transaction, where it's coming and where it's going. They didn't do anything because they were in a way they agreeing to this destruction that is taking place in Iraq.
There's a question. From what I understand of your position, it's what you seem to be describing is that the U.S. didn't stop the arming of Sunni rebel groups such as Al Qaeda and now ISIS, and are now paying.
Group. I wouldn't call them Sunni, terrorist group.
Fair
without
point.
labeling them.
Fair correction. And then and are now regretting it. But I think that's the bit I'm slightly. You seem to.
I'm not sure if they're regretting
it. Well,
it.
this is what I'm kind
so
of worried. I think they absolutely
acted
They absolutely are regretting
it. Convincing that they're not
it
happy about what's
anyone.
going on.
If ISIS achieves its aims, it doesn't suit anyone. Let's sort of just make the point, of course, that we're talking about them as a terrorist group. We've got used to it because of their sort of initial activities in the north of Syria, but their ambitions from the off were not to be a terrorist group.
Okay,
it was to be
hang on a second, Ross, because I do want to bring Abdul Rahman into the discussion and talk about what some of those ambitions might be. Actually, Dr. Wazni, I want to come to you with this. Are we seeing the destruction of the Sykes-Picot agreement here, the redrawing of the borders in the region?
Well, obviously there is something similar to it. The United States is, if it's the United States or some other country in the region, like to see a different mapping for the region. And the way they splitting up the region in a way is very destructive for the whole region. That's why we have war in Libya. Actually, the United States helped the fall of Libya, and now we have Al Qaeda and all these terrorist organizations in Yemen. We have a lot of terrorist organizations in Yemen, and we see the injustice that is taking place in Bahrain, and the United States is not saying a word about the injustice is taken in Bahrain. We see the disintegration in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. This is
what I want to sort of make the point. Everything you seem to be describing is through an unspoken prism of sectarianism. And that's my problem with some of the positions you're taking. Everything you're describing, it's like, oh, the US is supporting ISIS in Iraq, and then the Bahraini state against the Shia majority population, and you're trying to find a Shia victim in each of these places. And I think I completely agree that I think the US government and population.
There is misjustice in Bahrain.
And I was just about to say, I absolutely agree that the US completely would much rather see the Shia population, majority Shia population of Bahrain, better treated, and the minority Shia population
in Saudi Arabia are treated well.
That's what I'm saying, and then and the minority Shia population in Saudi.
Well, that's a bit of a stretch, Ross, because that could come at the expense of their Fifth Fleet.
That's what I mean. They, the reason they're not pushing any further is because they understand that they're in this situation where they've got skin in the game there, and they know that they can push so far on humanitarian issues in other countries and human rights abuses in other countries, but they know that for reasons of realpolitik that they cannot push too far, and that's the line they're always walking. I think there is definitely an argument to be had about whether they should be prioritizing human rights in these countries above others. But the point that needs to be made is that the US does not see this as a sectarian conflict, not by conflict, not by a long stretch. The reason they are opposed to ISIS is because they don't care whether it's a Sunni group or a Shia group. They are absolutely opposed to the ISIS project, which is for a state in the north. Well, if they're
opposed, let's do something about it. Let's go after them. Let's arm the Iraqi people. Let them fight, and let the United States release these shipment of weapons that the Iraqi bought it with their money, and let the Iraqi people strong enough to counter these terrorist organizations.
Would you say that they should do the same for the Free Syrian Army in the north?
If they that same terrorists, they came from Syria.
Yeah, but the FSA is completely different.
Iraq.
These are different people and the different organizations.
Al Qaeda in Syria and in Iraq, there is no difference between them.
Exactly the point. That's exactly the point.
The United States accepted those free army in Syria. They're not free.
The FSA were moderate. No, the FSA were very moderate
in Syria, and
they weren't armed because the fear was that they might turn into.
That's the misguided policy.
It's not.
America supporting terrorism in Syria, and they continue to actually support it in Iraq.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, I know that we can discuss this issue for much, much longer. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for this week's edition of the show. I would like to thank my guests for a very heated, interesting discussion there. Of course, Dr. Kamel Wazni, he is a Mid-East affairs expert. Also in the studio with me, Mr. Ross Fitzgerald, a Beirut-based journalist. And from London, we were joined by Mr. Abdul Rahman Jamil. He is a political analyst. And thank you for watching this edition. And we'll see you again next week at the same time.
It is no secret to all Iraqis the dangerous goals behind the call for the formation of a national salvation government. It is simply an attempt by those who rebel against the constitution to end the young democratic process and confiscate the opinions of the voters and circumvent of the constitutional merits. The call for the formation of a national salvation government is a coup against the constitution and the political process.